So what we're going to be doing now in this next session is pulling together two stories. One of the things I said to you before is that what happens when we do use our imagination. What happens when you start telling stories and use your imagination is you realise you've got to join things together. You can't just have the kind of the photo book version of the Gospels. And so one of the things that I've done in a story that I will read you shortly is to join together the story of the healing of Simon's mother-in-law with the parable of the yeast. And one of the interesting questions I think that you can do when you're reflecting on the Gospels is asking the question, what goes together with these stories? Imagine, for example, like you live in Capernaum, and we'll talk about Capernaum in a moment. Therefore, if you live in Capernaum, then you are going to encounter all the things that happened in Capernaum. It's a really obvious thing to say, isn't it? But we forget that actually somebody who lives in the village of Capernaum will know about, even if they weren't there, they'll know about Jesus and the boats and the stilling of the storm. They will know about the calling of Matthew because they'll have heard people tell about it. They'll know about the story of the healing of Simon's mother-in-law. They will know probably about the healing of the 5,000 because people imagine that it's on a hill very close to Capernaum. So just to kind of having those kind of in your mind that actually for the people of the Gospels, if you need to know where something happened, because then you'll be able to join together some really interesting stories because they will be joined together for them. Whether they were there, whether they've heard tales about it, but certainly it will be kind of joined together. And the very interesting question is how much of other stories did people hear? So if something happened in the Decapolis on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, would they have heard about that? Would they have come? And again, that's up for you to use your imagination to think about it. But it's those kinds of questions become very interesting. So let's just begin by reading the story to remind you of it. And it's on the back of your timetable. And you're very welcome either to read it in that version or your favourite version that you've brought with you, but just to give you a sense of the story. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. And then the parable of the yeast. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour, until all of it was leavened. So the first thing to draw your attention to, and you've probably noticed this already, but let me just remind you of it, is that the gospel stories are really sparse. Really, really sparse. There's lots of room around the edges for imagining things into them. But if you pay really close attention, you get some really fascinating details. In a moment, I will show you a picture of where people think Simon's house was in Capernaum. And when you know where Simon's house was in Capernaum, you realise that when it says as soon as they left the synagogue, they really meant that, because actually it's about 50 yards away. I mean, he had barely stepped out of the synagogue before he got to Simon's house. So it's those kinds of details that become really, really interesting. But if you have a look at that story to begin with, the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, the thing I would encourage you to reflect on when you go away for your own personal reflection is how much is not told to you. So, for example, how many other people were there living in the house? When Jesus' mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, was she in the main room? Was she in other rooms? How long had she been in bed with a fever? What kind of fever was it? Was it a life-threatening one or simply, flu? What was going on for her? How old was she? Why was she living with Simon and Andrew? all sorts of questions. There's so many more that you can ask. But so the first thing that I would encourage you to do when you want to inhabit a story is to ask questions of it. What questions do you need to know in order for you to be able to inhabit it more fully? And then the second thing that you always need to do, particularly when you're thinking about the Gospels, is to ask the question, where is this? Where is it taking place? And the other very interesting thing to do, once you've started asking that as a question, is then to say, what other things happened in the same place as this? Because again, we forget to do that the whole time. As I've said, if you live in Capernaum, you will have known all sorts of things that have happened. So collecting together all the stories that happened in Capernaum is a really interesting thing. And then, one of the things that I think is fascinating to do is to imagine that, well, and this is not a leap of imagination, they all knew each other. Because Capernaum's not a big village. Really isn't. And again, one of the things that we often do is we forget that the people in the early church lived in small communities. And any of you who live in a small community, even if you live in a middling-sized community, you will know that you know everybody, and even if you weren't there for an event, you will find out about the event because everybody talks about it. So that kind of sense of connection. Let me give you an illustration from something else completely, but just to give you an idea of how we inhabit the Bible in silos so easily. So, Christian tradition says that after Jesus' resurrection, Mary went to live with John the Apostle. Christian tradition also says that that happened in Ephesus. So therefore, the Gospel of John was probably written in Ephesus, if you think John the Apostle wrote the Gospel of John. There is a letter from Paul to the Ephesians. And what no scholars ever do is imagine that the community out of which the Gospel of John emerged was the same community that received the epistle to the Ephesians. That connection is never made. And that Mary might have been present both for the writing of the Gospel of John and for the hearing of the reading of the letter to the Ephesians. When you do that little simple joining up, there's really interesting things to do with that. And yet we mostly don't do it because we're not imagining ourselves into a situation. And so that's why I really want to encourage you to ask questions about place the whole time. Where is this? Why did it happen here? What else happened here? And that, if there's just one thing you can do to improve your inhabiting the text through your imagination, that's the one thing you can do. Have a look at the maps, see what it looks like. So in a moment, we are going to have a look at a map. But the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the other little detail, because, again, one of the questions I'm asked more often than any other question is, do we know if the disciples had families? And with the assumption that they didn't. They all were just kind of single men who went off and did their stuff. We do know the disciples had families because here's an example of a disciple having a family. And so then the question is, what did the family think about them going off following Jesus? What was going on there? And we know, so we've got the mother-in-law here, we've got Zebedee, the father of James and John. We have examples of family life. So then the question is, what did it feel like for the families when all of a sudden these young men suddenly upped and offed and followed Jesus? What was going on there in that whole dynamic? And it's worth just asking that question. I've been bashing on about place, so now let me talk to you about why Capernaum is a really important place. One of the fascinating things to notice is that Jesus grew up in Nazareth, but he didn't minister in Nazareth. He ministered in Capernaum. His base was very clearly Capernaum from the Gospels. So if you just have a look at a map, you'll begin to understand why and why this was really quite important. Can you see, I haven't got a pointer thing, but can you see Nazareth? If you see the Sea of Galilee, go towards the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, go left, and you can see Nazareth. Nazareth is, even today, a bit of a bywater. You don't go to Nazareth unless you're going to Nazareth. It's not one of those places that you travel through. And it was especially the case during the time of Jesus, because if you were travelling from Jerusalem up to Galilee, one of the things that you would need to do, and you will probably all know this already, is you need to avoid Samaria. You don't go through Samaria. We can have a conversation. If anyone's interested, I can do you the long version, but for the short version is you don't go through Samaria. So either what you would do in order to get up to Galilee, which they would do on a regular basis, is you would take the coastal road. So the coastal road was non-Samaritan. So you would go out to Caesarea probably, and then up to Galilee, or you'd cross the Jordan and go up through the Decapolis. And when you see that, you'll see that you wouldn't go through Nazareth. Because what you would do is you would bypass Nazareth. You'd go up to where... you see that little bit where it sticks out a little bit on the coast? That's modern-day Haifa. And then it was a vibrant city. And what you would do is you would go up to Haifa and cut across. So it's a long way to tell you, Nazareth is not a place you would visit. And people reckon at the time of Jesus that there were about 20 families living in Nazareth. It's a very, very small place then. Not a vast place now, but it was very small then. So therefore, when you ask the question, why did Jesus move from Nazareth to Capernaum, you can see a really easy answer for why he moved. He could have proclaimed the good news of the kingdom of God till kingdom come, literally, in Nazareth, and hardly anyone would have heard it because there were not very many people there. People didn't travel through it. Capernaum was a much better place to have as the centre of your ministry. For this, apologies, I could only find a map with someone's copyright details on, so I used it nevertheless, because I couldn't find another one. The thing that you need to know about is that red line. The red line is really important during the time of Jesus, and it's called the Via Maris. Can you see it up there on the top right-hand corner? The Via Maris was one of the major trade routes that existed during the time of Jesus and in the Roman Empire. It began in Alexandria and went past Galilee all the way over and then joined in with one of the eastern trade routes that then took you off to what modern-day Iraq and Iran. So it's one of the key trade routes that existed during the time of Jesus. And the most important things you will see from the red line, that it comes in through Magdala, place where Mary Magdalene probably came from, over the top of the Sea of Galilee, and a point there is Capernaum. Now, I haven't got another map for you, but if I just go back to the previous map. The other thing that you need to know is in this period, the land was split up between the sons of Herod. If you remember that, Herod the Great died, and he split his territory between three of his sons. The first was Herod Archelaus, who got Judea. Then you've got Herod Antipas, who got kind of most of Samaria and Galilee. And then you've got Philip, not Herod Philip, who is incidentally a different Herod, but Philip, who got the other side of the Jordan, the Decapolis, and that area. So if you were trading, and this is the really important bit, and you were carrying your goods up the Via Maris from Alexandria, up the coastal route, cutting across, you would get to Capernaum, and that is the border between Herod Antipas's territory and Philip's territory. So the reason why this is important is, ever wondered why there was a tax collector in Capernaum? He was taking the border tax of people travelling east to west on the Via Maris. The other thing is that Capernaum was, as it is today, a thriving hub of a village. It was where most people did their fishing from. You would fish further out in Galilee, but they would kind of come back and land their catch in Capernaum, and then they'd take it off to Sepphoris, which was one of the major Roman trading posts at the time. The reason why I wanted to go on about that a little bit is it gives you a sudden sense of what was going on for Jesus, is that if he wanted to proclaim the good news in Galilee, the place to do it was Capernaum, because it was a place that people came through, trading in different directions. People came for fish. People then went off to Sepphoris to do their trading of the fish. It was a crucial hub. And that begins to give you a kind of real sense of what was going on in this story. And lots of other stories. So when you have the kind of mention in the Gospels about Jesus being in and around Capernaum, I hope now you can begin to see why he was in and around Capernaum. It was made a whole load more sense than being in and around Nazareth, which wouldn't have really had the same kind of impact. So the next thing to draw your attention to is Peter's house. Now, I have to become a New Testament scholar for a moment and go, well, do we know that it was Peter's house? How could we know that that in fact was Peter's house? The answer is that the earliest Christian community thought that it was. So there is evidence from the 2nd century of this being an early church that they had, they had identified it, and you can find all sorts of archaeological remains in which they've plastered the house, which didn't really happen in this period. There were designs drawn on it that were connected to both Jesus and to Peter, and therefore, as far as archaeological remains go, it's about as good as you can get, because it looks as though the earliest Christian community said, we think this is where Peter's house was. And you can't be sure. You could probably say to me, are you absolutely confident? And I would go, no, because I'm a New Testament scholar. I'm very rarely confident about anything. But I'm about as confident as I could get to. Incidentally, there was one moment, I think I told you I was recently in the Holy Land leading a pilgrimage, which was fabulous. And I just had one moment where I went, I can be absolutely confident about this. This is so exciting, because we went to Jacob's Well, where Jesus met the Samaritan woman. Wells don't move. So therefore, this is the well that Jesus went to with the Samaritan woman. And it was kind of, I had that rare moment where I went, I can be utterly confident. You can say to me, are you sure that was Jacob's well? And I can say, yes. Apart from that, I won't. But generally, that was really quite interesting. So as I said, they found the remains of a 1st century house on the shore of Capernaum, of the shore of Galilee in Capernaum, which clearly the earliest Christian community believed to be the house of Peter. And as I say, it's about as good as it gets in terms of archaeological evidence. Various things to know about the house are that it was bigger than most of the other houses in Capernaum, only by a smaller way, but it was nevertheless a bigger house. And that tells you something really important about Peter and Andrew. One of the things that causes me to grind my teeth inexorably when people talk about Peter is they like to say he was just a simple fisherman. And that phrase annoys me more than anything. First of all, take off just. Because actually, even if he was a simple fisherman, that's a really great and skilled craft. Then take off the word simple, because the archaeological evidence that we have suggests that he lives in the biggest house in Capernaum. If he lives in the biggest house in Capernaum, he was not a simple fisherman, he was a highly successful businessman from the 1st century. And therefore, you end up with the word fisherman, and that'll do nicely for me. But that kind of whole assumption that Peter is uneducated because he's a fisherman, actually, if he's a highly successful businessman, he takes his fish from Capernaum to trade in Sepphoris, as I've mentioned Sepphoris a few times. Sepphoris is the major trading town in Rome in the period. The Romans did not speak Aramaic or Greek. They spoke Latin. They might have spoken a little bit of Greek, but they're mostly going to have spoken Latin. So therefore, Peter could speak Aramaic, definitely Greek, possibly also Latin. You're beginning to get a different picture of this person, this just a simple fisherman person. He clearly was highly successful because of the size of his house, and therefore you begin to have to re-inhabit that bit of your imagination. Yes, we all know, if you read Mark's Gospel, Peter gloriously puts his foot in it time and time again. I know many academics who are very good at putting their foot in things on a regular basis. Just because he puts his foot in things does not mean that you're allowed to construct this picture of him being just a simple fisherman. Shall I stop ranting now? But I think it's actually quite an important thing. And one of the things that people do is they say he was just a simple fisherman. Therefore, the epistle of 1 Peter can't have been written by him because it was written in really good Greek. And that causes me to go, because actually, I think there's very strong evidence that his Greek would have been excellent, and therefore he could have written 1 Peter. He might not have done, but he could have done. And that, I think, is an important thing. And the other thing I've told you already, but just to remind you, this house really is 50 yards from the synagogue in Capernaum. So therefore, that sense of Jesus being really there and just moving out of the synagogue and getting to the house is striking. And then on the other side of the house, I just want to give you a beautiful picture of Galilee. So if you go off the other side, the synagogue is here, then there's the house, and then you get directly to Galilee. And this is the view that you have on the other side of Peter's house. And again, just trying to get that sense of what it looked like, that feeling of being there on the shores of Galilee and encountering Jesus, listening to his teaching. And the other thing that I really noticed when I was there a few weeks ago, that I had noticed before again, but hadn't quite clocked, is, in Mark's gospel, they talk about going over to the other side a lot of the time, and they went over to the other side. And scholars sit there going, yeah, but it wasn't really the other side, because the other side is a bit further down than that. I think when you're there and you're seeing the view, you realise what they meant by the other side. Because that looks like the other side to me. It might just, if we just go up to the map again. There we go. So that was there, and what you can see is about there. So yeah, technically, it's not the other side. But if you're there and you're looking at the view, it is the other side, isn't it? And I think you begin to get that sense of the way in which their life kind of focused around the Sea of Galilee, and you could see, and you would have this side, which is the place where I am, and what I can see is the other side. And then you begin to get the dynamic of what's going on in Mark's Gospel. So what else can we know about this story? We've talked about the size of the house already. Let me then move on to think about the parable of the yeast, which, as I say, I want to stitch into this story because I think it's quite an interesting. As I've said, one of the really interesting things that happens when you're trying to tell your own stories or when you're imagining in terms of engaging is you realise that actually you have to pull in all sorts of other stories in order to make it make sense. And the parables, as you know, can be stories of extraordinary tales. So there are some parables, like there was once a king who decided to go into battle, and he sat down and he counted out how many soldiers he would need to go into battle, and then he decided whether he would go or not, one of Jesus's parables. But other parables are, there was once a woman who took some yeast and buried it in the flour. And so you've got both everyday events and absolutely extraordinary not everyday events. And I think one of the things that we have to remember when Jesus is telling the parables is that the people who were listening to Jesus, if they have a mind like mine, not a mind like yours, but if they have a mind like mine, then they're seeing the woman putting the yeast into the flour. I think I'm still fascinated by the not seeing things question. But I think one of the things that you've got in the parables is Jesus is calling to mind, you know what it looks like when a landowner goes away and the slaves all misbehave. You know about that, don't you? You know about what it looks like when a sower goes sowing. Those kinds of things begin to get you into Jesus helping people to inhabit the stories for themselves. And the thing you have to know about the parable of the yeast, and I think is absolutely fascinating, is this was not a woman making a loaf of bread. This was a woman feeding the entire village. And that, I think, is one of the really interesting things. So the quantities that are involved, 3 measures, we know how big a measure is. So 3 measures would make bread sufficient to feed 100 people. And that's one of the really kind of striking bits about this parable, is this is not just an ordinary amount of, this is not her getting up in the morning and going, I'm feeling a bit peckish, I'll make bread for the family for today. This is a feast. This is enough for everybody to come and join in it. And you will know about the parables of the kingdom, but one of the beautiful things about the parable of the kingdom, and one of the things we need to remind ourselves of time and time again, is that the strand of parables that are about growing, and there's a lot of parables that are about growing, are all about how the kingdom cannot help but grow. You sow the seed, it grows. You put the yeast in the bread, it grows. What the kingdom does is grow and grow and grow. And the important bit of this parable is that the woman takes the yeast and she puts it in this insane quantity of flour, and the bread is formed by it. And a reminder to those of you who might be looking around the church at the moment and saying, but it doesn't look like anything's happening. The point about the yeast parable is that it doesn't look like it's growing, but it is growing, because the kingdom can't help itself. It just grows. That's the nature of the kingdom. So even if you don't think it is, it is. And what Jesus is reminding us of in this parable is that even when it looks like nothing is happening, it is always growing, because that's what the kingdom does. And if you think it's not growing, you might possibly be looking for the wrong thing in the kingdom, is always the kind of suggestion of the parables. So what I'd like to do now is to read you a story, so that you get a sense of one way of doing it. Don't let this hamper your imagination. Do use your imagination however you would like. But this is a story I've written about Simon's mother-in-law and about the yeast, and it goes like this. You won't have heard of me. You may never even have thought about me. Though, if you think about it now, you know I existed. If Peter had a mother-in-law, he had to have had a wife. That's me, Peter's mother-in-law's daughter. Quite a mouthful, wouldn't you say? You might find it easier to call me Leah. I married Simon when I was little more than a girl, and he a strapping young man, learning his trade with his brother Andrew. They were great fishermen, were Simon and Andrew. Our life wasn't easy, but it was good. Fish prices were high, and when Simon built us our own house in Capernaum, it was bigger than all of our neighbours' houses, big enough for my mother to join us after my father died. We never lacked for something to eat, so long as she didn't mind fish. But then it all changed. We heard of him before we ever saw him. Jesus, son of the builder Joseph from Nazareth, spreading his wise sayings around our busy town. We used to joke that he'd bored the few residents of that tin pot town Nazareth witless, so he had to move on and find new people. It used to be funny, until one of those new people was my Simon. One day, he just didn't come home from mending the nets, and neither did Andrew. We heard what had happened from Zebedee's wife, Hannah. Jesus had passed by and said, "Follow me." And just as Zebedee was laughing at the arrogance of it all, they did. Up they got, and off they went, just like that. When Simon eventually deigned to come home, he was different. His eyes shone. He stood taller, looked happier. But I didn't notice that at the time. I was too busy shouting. We took turns, my mother and I, but our words glanced off him as though he barely noticed them. "Call me Peter," he said. "The Rock. That's my new name." I called him other things. And he smiled. Smiled, I ask you. Jesus said he'd come to set families against each other, he told us calmly as he walked out the door. One day, not long afterwards, my mother came in shiny with sweat from the marketplace. "You'll never guess what Jesus has said now," she said. I didn't even try. Apparently Aaron, our town scribe, nobly offered to follow Jesus. He should have been grateful. That priestly family can trace their roots all the way back to the first Aaron. But was he? Of course not. Aaron's father had just died, and all he wanted to do was bury him. He was his only son. There was no one else. It would have taken a week or so at most to obey all the rituals. But let the dead bury their own dead, Jesus had said. When she'd finished telling me this, my mother sank down onto a bench. At first, I thought she was overwhelmed by the horror of it all. It turned out she wasn't. The sweat on her brows wasn't from the hot summer's day, but from a fever that quickly took hold. I sat with her day and night as she got worse and worse. Our house closed in around me, the darkness pushing in as I knew she'd begun to slip away. I felt him before I saw him. The darkness shifted behind me as though pressed outwards by a light. One moment, the house was silent, save for my mother's rasping breath. The next, it was full. I barely noticed. Jesus reached out, touched her hand, and she sat up, just like that. He turned and looked at me, his eyes twinkling. And in that moment, all my anger and pain melted away. In that moment, I understood. We cooked up a feast that day, my mum and I. Peter, yeah, all right, I did start calling him that, and his new friends laughed at us, asking if we were expecting the entire village. After all, I did use 3 measures of flour. But Jesus didn't laugh. He looked at me, right at me, signalled I should sit at his feet with the others, like I was actually one of his disciples. And he said, "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened." Then he smiled at me. Peter looked sheepish, but I sat taller in my place. You won't have heard of me. After today, chances are you will never think of me again. But you know, that doesn't matter at all. There is someone who knows me, who really knows me, and that will always be enough.